My name is Ike Yuri, and I'm a doctoral student here in the Department of Sociology at Brown University. And along with Danielle Falzon, it's a pleasure to welcome everyone here today. And so today's talk is the second in a series that Danielle and I have organized focused on climate change in South Asia. And we were motivated to do this just because the effects of the climate crisis are quickly becoming manifest and intensifying throughout South Asia, and it's important to study the political and social implications of these changes. And we're grateful, of course, to the Center for Contemporary South Asia at Brown for facilitating today's event. And I'll pass things off to Danielle to introduce our speaker today.
Hi, everyone. I'm thrilled today to introduce Dr. Farhana Sultana. I think she was recently promoted to full professor in the Department of Geography and the Environment at the Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs at Syracuse University. Dr. Sultana's work approaches political ecology, climate justice, and water governance from a transnational, feminist, and decolonial standpoint. And she's truly pushing the normative bounds of work on climate change and justice in the global South, particularly in South Asia and Bangladesh. Her work has gained her international recognition, including a meeting with Pope Francis when she was invited to speak on the human right to water in Vatican City in 2017. And this is something I truly admire about Dr. Sultana's work, that she makes her scholarship public. And that includes public events, interviews in major news outlets, including BBC and Scientific American, appearances on podcasts like One Planet, and op-eds. And I was actually fortunate enough to meet Dr. Sultana on my very first trip to Bangladesh as I was getting my dissertation work started. We were both at a conference called Gobeshona on climate change in Bangladesh. And her feminist take on the gendered implications of climate change truly shaped my perspective on the social dimensions of climate impacts. And I'll also say she handled a, let's say, difficult American man in the audience with integrity and grace, which was also a lesson that I did not forget. So thank you for the example you set on both counts. So today we'll hear more about Dr. Sultana's work on critical climate justice, and I'll note that her article of the same title was the most downloaded paper in 2021 from the Royal Geographical Society's Geographical Journal, and we're very lucky to have her join us for this virtual event today. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Farhana Sultana.
Thank you so much, Danielle. And thank you to everyone at Brown University and the Watson Institute for inviting me to speak with you today. It's a real delight. I was supposed to be there in person, but for various reasons, we're doing this virtually. But I also hope that means that more people can join in from around the world. So I just want to give a quick context to this work in light of Danielle's introduction. So I've been working on issues around climate change and water governance and climate justice for a very, very long time. And I know that more and more people are becoming more aware of what's going on with climate change. And in light of the recently published IPCC report that talks about vulnerabilities on climate change, I want to basically kind of draw our attention to global scale climate justice issues, but then also make it relatable to different regions or different locales, depending on your interests, where your research interest might be. So I have a few slides to share. I'm just going to go ahead and share that. So this is, again, it's just the title slide, which you should be able to see. It is the title of my paper, which was widely popular when it was published last year. You can definitely access it. It's available on the journal's website, but also my website, which is literally my name. It's farhanasultana.com. So what I want to do today is to talk about climate justice, because it's become such a rallying cry globally, and in terms of what it means to think about it more critically, in terms of both theoretical, but then also pragmatic implications of that. But then to first do that, let me just backtrack, because not everybody has the same understanding of why we need to understand climate justice a little bit more critically. So let me just do some very quick background context work. So most of you know that, we talk about or hear about climate breakdown, and global events around climate-related disasters have become more profound in recent years. And that's why we're talking and hearing more about the term called climate justice. And because of the intensifying injustices from climate breakdown, and then also the overlapping injustices we've seen for the last 2 years with the COVID-19 pandemic, we're starting to see where the fault lines are, where societal breakages occur, and where there are different forms of suffering across sites and scales. And so what a climate justice framework does is it really helps us think through and address these inequities that we see around us, or it gives us the tools with which to investigate and find out better, because we don't always know everything, right? So when we think about climate justice, we shift the conversation away from just climate change to much more ethical and justice concerns. So it's not just a scientific issue. Yes, it's a scientific issue. Yes, it's a natural phenomenon, but it's not just a techno-managerialistic issue. It's not just something to be solved with economics and technology. It is a moral, just, and ethical issue. And that's what climate justice does. It beckons us to have these kinds of difficult conversations. And what we're seeing is that because there's been so much talk about climate change for a long time, but more recent uptake in climate justice, we're also seeing a lot of rage and anger in terms of why have we not acted sooner? Because global temperatures have been rising, but action has been quite slow. So what climate justice does, it fosters greater critical conversations to talk about the impacts and outcomes of climate change, to talk about how climate change is a threat multiplier, but climate justice is fundamentally understanding what those threat multipliers are, and then how they affect people differently or differentially and unevenly and disproportionately, and then look at how do we dismantle and address the systems, right? So dismantle the systemic and structural issues that cause these marginalizations, exploitations, and oppressions to occur. So what it does is climate justice makes climate a political issue. We need to therefore question our political commitments, and it's an intentional process that really involves carefully analyzing who's being left out, what is being left out, which voices are being left out, who is marginalized, both through not just climate impacts, but then also the mitigation and adaptation efforts that come in its name. So what climate justice does, it helps us draw out or asks us to ask questions about who benefits, who loses out, in what ways, where, and why. So it's an explanatory tool to help us make better sense of the relationships at different scales that maintain the injustices and then what we can do about it. Because we know that climate change is a planetary crisis, but there is a common and undifferentiated responsibility. This was raised in 1992 by the UNFCCC, and it was laid out quite clearly in the 1992 Earth Summit. Yes, it's a common responsibility, but it's very disproportionately created and disproportionately experienced. So if we've known this for about 30 years, why are we still having these conversations now? Because there's a lot of resistance, right? There's a lot of resistance to how to go about doing it. How do we tackle this? Who should we listen to? And then there's also the historical and geographical differences in terms of who has been paying the price for how long and who's been unburdened or unharmed until much more recently. So what we start to see is therefore we ask wider questions about colonialism and capitalism and globalization and issues around trade warfare. All of these issues are entangled with uneven climate injustices. So we have to look at how they're interlocking. These interlocking systems of oppression create and produce or co-create and co-produce various climate injustices. So what it means is we need to therefore identify the injustices, name them, and then figure out what we can do. So as a result, what this means is critical climate justice is essentially praxis. So praxis means theoretically informed practice with reflection. So there's a constant feedback mechanism and integration of both theory, reflection, action in a continual cycle. So you have constant improvement. And when we talk about climate justice praxis, we look at these demands that are made to systems change from young people now, young people 30 years ago. These systems change demands are being made for quite some time, but what are the structural inequities that destabilize, desires to pursue more equitable changes and address these injustices? So when you think about praxis as one that's very politically minded, that is ethically communicated, but that is also committed to working with other people, we start to look at how do we talk about harms? What are the kind of commitments to political action and solidarity we need to make? And we need to look at responsibility and exposure and vulnerability in much more nuanced and complex ways. And that raises issues of obligations and accountability and issues around human rights and the different parts of justice. Justice work is not easy. So we need to think about the political economy that produces and reinforces reinforces temporal and spatial harms, and then look at the ways that we can start to address these or chip away at them in small ways, but then also interconnect and leapfrog across scales to have more effective change over time. So when we think about a critical climate justice perspective, we ask these questions about how and why different groups face inequities, and then integrate the insights from various academic theories or scholarships and epistemologies, drawing from feminist scholarship, anti-racist, anti-capitalist, anti-colonial, decolonial, post-colonial scholarship, and then think about what it means to enact praxis within the climate justice movement. Because it is an academic theory, body of scholarship, climate justice, but is incredibly tied to praxis, to practical action. Indeed, the first time climate justice really came to the fore was at the 2002 Bali COP, or the COP, the Conference of Parties on Climate Change. That was 20 years ago. Right? So climate justice has always involved grassroots initiatives and activist alliances, labor unions, farmers unions, student youth movements for quite some time, for at least 2 decades, in terms of figuring out what are the collaborations that need to occur across places, then across different types of movements. And what climate justice praxis encourages is it encourages more types of rigorous collectivizing, deep reflection, accountability, but then also academic theorization that's empirically derived and contextually appropriate. So what it requires for scholars and students is to unlearn a lot of things, to unlearn, to relearn, and then to collaborate not in some sort of uncritical celebration of solidarity devoid of material action or outcomes, but it involves a kind of reevaluation and redressing the different forms of inequities that exist within movements, beyond movements, and the ways they articulate over time and in different ways. So we know that, yes, there can be fractures and differentiations internally, but we know that there's an overarching commonality in trying to understand some loosely guided themes around what justice and equity and fairness are. So when we look at different types of climate justice movements or praxis solidarities and collectivities, we need to understand that, yes, they may be variegated, but at the same time, they are addressing wider concerns such as dismantling fossil fuel dependency, defetishizing endless economic growth on a finite planet, challenging non-participatory democracy, or resisting extractive exploitation of natural resources, or displacement of indigenous communities from their homelands, among other things. So there's a range of ways that different praxis around climate justice showcases itself, but then there's also some general themes in terms of what their guiding principles are, because the guiding principles such as equity and fairness, transparency, reparations, start to become more clarified, and they're more openly discussed, because you can't really have meaningful climate justice if you don't think about issues around space, place, scale, across time and history, across generations, but then also the spatiality of how colonialism and capitalism has reproduced crises in certain places, and definitely across the global South, and certainly in South Asia, but at different scales, right? Because oppressors exist everywhere, as do marginal communities. So we need to start seeing what the commonalities are across place and time. So one thing that critical climate justice as praxis does is it brings to question issues on power, around power structures, social disparities, and how these are embedded within multi-scalar institutions, wider political economy of development, foreign direct investment, international institutions around trade, around developmentalization. So we need to start asking these questions about, well, who's defining what policy and under what norms? How are marginalizations and vulnerabilities improved, ameliorated, or exacerbated in certain places? And then what does it mean to observe, to understand? And what are the matrices we're using to understand and observe? Whose voices are we helping elevate using our relational privileges? Because all of us have relational privileges. The fact that we're here today means that we have privilege of education, of communication, a certain form of Eurocentric hegemony in terms of use of the English language, right? We're already complicit in various forms of injustices, but that does not mean you cannot do something about it, right? You can definitely decenter yourself, you can decolonize knowledge, you can decolonize how you do your praxis in terms of elevating various forms of voices and having actual material-based solidarity praxis. So one thing that's really become apparent over time is how disaster frequencies are making certain communities very vulnerable, whether that's tropical cyclones, sea level rise, heat waves, wildfires, and so on. And the frequency and uncertainty and the variability of these events are increasing vulnerabilities over time and place. And therefore, those of us who have the privilege of voice and action and the ability to collectivize or have time, it behooves us to do things we can based on what we know, but then keep learning from others, right? Because we don't have all the answers. And I think that humility is something that's really also important in climate justice praxis, or at least I argue that it is. And we're seeing that there's also an increasing conversation around what kinds of climate debts need to be paid, what is climate apartheid in terms of some countries paying the price longer, for instance, small island nation states, but then also coastal low-lying countries. How does racial capitalism and colonialism articulate with contemporary neoliberal globalization? How can we think about the role of the nation state, where the complicities, who are the different actors, and then how do countries internally colonize and then also externally create various forms of necropolitics? Those are the kinds of difficult conversations that climate justice praxis asks us to talk about past injustices, ongoing injustices, and those that are coming down the pike. Because we need to really think about what climate coloniality means. And it is that ongoing continuity of coloniality showing up through climate change that's resulting in greater forms of harm and contextual injustices. So this brings me to the next point that I want to make, which is about when we talk about climate justice, we need to therefore ask the question of what is the justice we're talking about, because there's a lot of misconception around this. So I'm just going to cover it very briefly for the sake of time. So we know that one of the issues why we haven't seen a lot of action around climate change for some time is because it's a normative issue. When we talk about climate justice, we're talking about normative issues around distribution and power. And those are things that are really hard to have conversations around if people with power and wealth and elite capture are unwilling to give up those forms of power and wealth and access to privilege. So when we talk about climate change, instead of climate change, but we talk about climate justice, we start to have these issues around what do we mean by justice, recognition justice or distributive justice, procedural justice, transformative justice. There are many theories of justice. So there's a lot of talk about climate justice without a lot of clarity by people who use the term of what justice means. So I always encourage my students and everybody to learn more, because you only arm yourself with more knowledge and therefore you're able to have better praxis because you're doing that right theory, reflection, better theory and action. So in very basic terms, so recognition justice means acknowledging that there's differential harm, right? There's spatial, meaning across communities and countries, but temporal, meaning intergenerational over time through histories of imperialism and colonialism and into the future. So when you think about vulnerabilities and harms, we need to be able to understand that these harms occur in different ways at different registers. We need to be able to recognize that. And as a result, international negotiations often falter because this is where some of the stickiness is, that there's lack of recognition, or if there's recognition, there isn't a willingness to take responsibility and accountability. So when we then think about distributive justice in terms of, who will cut down emissions, by how much of greenhouse gas emissions, who has the burden of doing, let's say, degrowth, given historical oppression and benefit, as opposed to who has the right to have a little bit more, subsistence emissions as opposed to luxury emissions. So these are all very controversial terms, but these are the kinds of conversations that keep coming up in terms of what does it mean to talk about climate justice in relation to sustainable development, in relation to water security, in relation to fair trade and financing. So we need to start having these difficult conversations around distributive justice, which then links obviously to procedural justice, in terms of international negotiations and the systems that are in place. I mean, who has voice? What are the imbalances in geopolitical and historical power relations between and across countries in terms of who's at the table to debate climate finance, how is that skewed, away from global South countries in favor of, let's say, the US, Canada, UK, Australia, and Europe. So what are the ways that we can think about international guidelines and negotiations in terms of historic responsibility, and then think about how do we get out of being mired in politics and power structures that are, centuries in the making, but then how do we talk about how coloniality shows up in trade policies? What is the role of the IMF and the WTO or the World Bank or the UN? How do we think about different NGOs and INGOs and BINGOs, right? The big international NGOs. What are the roles of, or something like, the ecological unequal exchange? Or how do we think about climate finance as a form of climate reparations, but in terms of giving more autonomy and freedom to different countries to have say and have more fair share? So one thing that I've been advocating for is one way to think about these what seems to be intractable problems is to perhaps draw some insights from feminist scholarship. Because one thing that has become really apparent over the last couple of decades is that climate justice won't be as effective or equitable without some feminist perspectives. Because critical feminist analysis reveals often overlooked or buried concerns. It exposes inequities and harms that are local and global, that go from the body to the planetary scale. Because most transnational feminist scholarship integrates various forms of other epistemologies, drawing from critical race theory, anti-colonial, decolonial, and post-colonial scholarship, but then also about, more than human geographies and multi-species justice. So when you think about these kinds of issues, we recognize that a lot of feminists, not just feminist scholars, but feminist activists have been raising these issues. So it was, for instance, in the 2007 COP, where the banners were raised that no climate justice without gender justice. And in terms of thinking about how women have been at the forefront of climate justice, because it isn't just women are inherently being more prone to climate breakdown, it's because patriarchy positions women and gender minorities in certain ways to experience climate breakdown that is not very helpful in terms of thinking about how different societies relate to different forms of patriarchal power structures. So when we think about intersectionality and gendered intersectional marginalizations and inequalities and burdens and vulnerabilities, we can start to see how feminist scholarship helps us clarify what's going on the ground, but then also in terms of how institutions operate. In terms of where you live, who you are, what you have. Sure, feminist scholarship helps identify often invisible contours of suffering, but it also highlights how institutions and policies and governance structures operate to maintain kind of a heteropatriarchal capitalist colonial mindset in terms of making certain groups experience climate injustices differently or more acutely. So what feminist scholars have been doing is for a long time showcasing the multiple knock-on effects of the socio-ecological outcomes of climate breakdown, not just through looking at the lens of intersectionality, but then also looking at in terms of what does it mean to link patriarchy to socio-ecological crisis? Why we should not essentialize women and men into binary categories, but look at the different interlocking systems of oppression in that context as it makes sense, and then link it up to other contexts. And then how we can have more inclusive planning and action beyond techno-managerialistic climate solutions. So for instance, can we strengthen women's movements for strategic activism and advocacy and capacity building and resource and network access? And then how do we document different lives and elevate different voices so that we are therefore able to decolonize what climate knowledge is? What are the different forms of expertise that gets counted? Who is the expert? Maybe we need to shut up and give, cede the floor to other groups of people. So that is what some of the critical feminist insights bring to climate justice praxis in terms of thinking about inequities and injustices in more complex ways, but then also in more wide-ranging ways, because it helps elevate awareness about links, but then it showcases what are the similarities and differences or commonalities that exist and where strategies of alignment and solidarity building can be. So we can help collectivize better. So again, it goes back to what I was saying earlier. It is not an uncritical celebration of some vacuous hope of some vacuous ability to transform the world, but actually putting in sweat equity into doing the hard work, which means learning, which means re-theorizing, right, in terms of thinking about different things. However, at the same time, yes, feminism is not a magic bullet, right? Because there are all kinds of different challenges. But what it does do is it gives us a roadmap for analysis, for advocacy, for action, for collectivizing, for challenging various institutional and structural and systemic power strangles that hold us, in harm's way for so long. So we can start to therefore think about, what does equity mean? What does health mean? What does well-being mean away from economic growth? Can we think of the good life in different ways? So these are just some of the ways that, feminist insights help us kind of expand what I call critical climate justice in terms of thinking about feminist insights for praxis. So I want to just, before I end, just touch upon a few challenges that are ongoing. You've probably seen images like this for some time, given that, there's various forms of international levels of data that are shared. So when we think about, for instance, how quickly nation states adapted or responded to the COVID-19 pandemic in relation to how slow action has been on climate, we can start to see that, yes, faster resolution is possible when there's concerted effort and there's intention, right? When there's political intention and resources and manpower allocated. So we're seeing that aid organizations and international institutions are increasingly talking about climate justice in their interventions and in their funding. So, what are the ways that they're shifting priorities, and in what ways are they taking normative aspects of climate justice into account? And then also looking at issues around responsibility, both historical and contemporary. And then we can also therefore then think about, how do we disaggregate data by gender, race, class, and indigeneity? What does equitable and contextually appropriate intervention look like? Who are the local actors? What are the explicit understandings versus, and not romancing the local, right? Do not romanticize the community because communities are heterogeneous. And then it also raises the issue around, for instance, historical inequities in emissions in terms of not just countries, but groups of people, in terms of fossil fuel dependency, but then also in terms of production, consumption, and systemic waste produced by the elite of the world. And what does it mean that a much larger percentage of the world is paying the price for a much smaller group of people who are literally eating their way through the planet, and then how people are being kind of completely being tied to systems that are inequitable, and then how do we break away from that? So these are ongoing challenges that people are talking about. Then how do we talk about contemporary climate emissions, for instance, but then also how things are being offshored to other countries, but we're also extracting a lot of resources and labor power from poorer countries in the global south to resource rich and resource consumptive countries of the global north, and then how we're colonizing the atmosphere through that. So one of the ways that people have been talking about this is, okay, let's talk about climate finance or climate aid from industrialized countries to historically overexploited or historically intentionally underdeveloped countries across Africa, Asia, and Latin America. How do we link it to wider theoretical understandings of climate reparations? How do we think about responsibility? But then at the same time, also challenge issues around green capitalism. What are the various forms of sacrifice zones that are being offered up, at the altar of green capitalism or, colonial capitalism that is masquerading itself in various green forms, whether it's through land grabbing, biofuel, mining dispossessions, water contamination, and so on. So we need to have these wider conversations about world making that moves us away from centuries of a system that is continuing to harm people, right? But recognizing there are no quick fixes, but it does require first that political commitment and that intentionality. So when I think about ongoing challenges and then moving forward, what we can do is think about those interrelated but distinct approaches. So we can think about climate justice that moves away from an extractive economy to a regenerative economy. These include issues such as reciprocity, redistribution of power and self-determination, reparations, care, divestment, solidarity across differences, not espousing universalism, socialism, but thinking about, other things like transforming public institutions, public financing, deeper democracy, and so on. So again, these are really difficult asks, but they have to be asked if we're going to bring about change. So for instance, we've seen a lot of conversation in the last year about Build Back Better. What does Build Back Better mean? So what does this mean? And who is deciding the content of what this is? Who will benefit from this? Where will it take place? At what cost? In what ways are we externalizing certain forms of harms in order to have benefits in one place over another? These are the kinds of questions that a critical climate justice does. It asks questions so that we can improve, so we don't have cookie cutter approaches, right? So we can think about climate justice pathways that are more just, that involve more just energy transitions, that are more reciprocal, that are more about well-being rather than fossil fuel dependency. So there have been so many examples that have been put forth in terms of post-pandemic fiscal recovery that is gender accountable. For instance, the Feminist Green New Deal or the Feminist Fossil-Free Future in the Asia Pacific. So there's a lot of different ways that people are talking about, like multi-scalar, gender and race disaggregated data collection, greater monitoring, greater accountability, increasing capacity building, budgetary resources, but then also not just having a seat at the table, but determining what the table is, which is determining the terms of the debate. So it is not just about representation, but it's actually having a voice in determining these things, right? What does budgetary allocation mean if we are taking decolonizing seriously? What does Build Back Better mean if we are taking feminist approaches seriously? So these are the kinds of conversations that I'm hoping that people are taking, more seriously into account, because we can't rely on what we've had before. That's not giving us the solutions we need fast enough, and we need them faster because of where we are right now. So my main argument is that to reframe climate debates from, away from what we've known to better theory building and better action and better praxis. So whether that involves different forms of feminist insights and solidarity or other forms of epistemological, methodological interventions, we need to get away from techno-managerialistic solutions that don't deliver. We need to talk about issues that confront patriarchy and racial capitalism and coloniality, to look at the way these things intersect and then figure out what are the ways we can have better ethical research design, collaborative planning, better intervention, critical reflexivity. All of these are intentional processes and practices. So what we're seeing is that globally there is greater awareness around climate justice in the world. There's definitely more mobilization and action around it in the last 10, 20 years. Different groups and organizations have been trying to address it in their locality, in their region, across their country, but then also leapfrogging in terms of making scalar connections to other ways in order to accelerate more justice-oriented cooperation globally. Because if we want to, again, like I said, if we want to change the trajectory of the world, we need that greater political will, more people power, and kind of decolonizing global power structures that create and uphold the different forms of harms. So I just want to conclude with a couple of key points. Given that this talk was really wide-natured, it was probably quite complex, and I talk really fast, so there's a lot more going on in the publications that I welcome you to read, but let me just cover some of the key messages. So we see that climate justice has become a rallying cry across the globe, especially amongst young folks. But at the same time, we also recognize what this does is that it's not just a rallying cry, right? It makes us reflect on the ethical obligations and the relationships we have with other communities and other ecosystems in different places that we have political and material ties to. And climate change is effectively a moral and justice concern. It is not only an economic and scientific one. Therefore, it requires a revolutionizing of our mindsets and framing of issues. We need to therefore think about wider issues around democracy and citizenship and development and globalization in terms of thinking about our various histories and geographies and how we're located with the different relational powers, power and privileges that we do. So what feminist climate justice or critical climate justice does, it encourages policymakers and average citizens to approach climate change in more comprehensive ways. It asks us to have those accountabilities in mind for intersectional analysis, to paying attention to lived experiences, to listening to wisdom and expertise of different voices and situated subjects, to pay attention to understanding that we need to therefore expose and unearth the inequities, marginalizations, and vulnerabilities. We need to understand them better. Then we need to co-create and reconfigure what are the pathways forward, right? That we don't have one solution. We can't reproduce the same solutions in all the different places. We can have similar epistemological undergirdings, but things may look different in how they play out in a different place. But the overarching goal is to recognize and reduce harm, to recognize and reduce vulnerability, to recognize and reduce suffering, and then think about how these compound over time and place. And at the same time, we are ultimately working towards addressing systemic injustices, structural injustices that overlap and compound. So yes, we're doing everyday work, but we are also doing intentional work that is helping to dismantle wider systems that are not very helpful in having more capacious and more alternative, more fruitful futures that are more emancipatory, that allow for greater self-determination, liberation for larger numbers of people. And it therefore means that decision makers are held more accountable because more people understand what's going on and more people are revolutionized to think about systems change and structural change. They understand what extractivism means and capitalism means and colonialism means and patriarchy means and how these are interconnected. And then we can therefore learn from each other and connect and organize and collaborate and support each other to do more. So as I always say, do what you can from where you are with what you have and do better next time. And you lift while you climb. As you're improving, you help somebody else improve, help someone else learn, recognize what you need to unlearn, to relearn, to do better each time. And it's an ongoing process. That's what praxis means, because we need to understand to tackle systemic and structural issues. We need to do these things in very concerted, intentional ways. Otherwise, restorative measures will ultimately fail, collapsing under the weight of their own inequality. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sultana. That was excellent. So for the Q&A, we're going to ask folks to drop their questions in the chat, and I will read them out, or I will moderate the chat to make sure we're catching everything. We're going to try and keep it to an hour total, so hopefully we can wrap things up by 3, because Dr. Sultana is unfortunately suffering from a case of bronchitis, and we don't want to strain her voice too much. You're really, thank you for joining us despite that today. So if anyone has a question to start us off, I'll give you all a second to type things out in the chat, and then we'll get going. All right, so we have one from Maggie. Might you speak a bit about the war in Ukraine as it's related to the broader discussion of climate justice?
All right, yeah, thank you for that. So when we talk about kind of fossil fuel warfare, we need to put it on a wider map, right? So the war in Ukraine really has brought to the fore greater conversations around that kind of fossil fuel dependency. What are we doing in terms of reliance on petroleum-based or fossil fuel-based products? In what ways are geopolitical maneuverings, occurring? But at the same time, I also want to draw our attention to the fact that fossil fuel warfare has occurred in the Middle East for decades. You didn't see the same form of outcry and support, right? When things were happening in Iraq or Syria or Yemen and so on. So what I do ask is that we should absolutely care for all refugees and people being under various forms of absolutely dehumanizing conditions, but we need to put in a wider spectrum of that global geopolitical hegemony of fossil fuel extractive capitalism, and then the military industrial complex that various geopolitical power structures, such as the US, benefit from having warfare in places. And then now we see other countries, right? So everyone is chasing the same fossil fuel sources or different types of fossil fuel sources. And it's creating various forms of refugees and crises in many places. So if anything, if the Ukraine situation has educated wider number of people to think about climate justice, then we need to absolutely have those conversations, that we need to recognize that the historicity of the various forms of resource grabs. And it's not just fossil fuel warfare since World War II. It's before that. Think about coal. Think about what drove the entire engine of racial capitalism and the Industrial Revolution. So these are not isolated incidences. They have a long genealogy of their connections. They have different empirical outcomes in different places. But at the same time, it makes us alert and become more aware of the fact that we therefore need to have real hard conversations around the role of the fossil fuel military industrial complex, the role of the fossil fuel industry in climate denialism, in terms of fueling different forms of warmongering cultures, at the same time thinking of how geopolitical power structures can perhaps be dismantled away from fossil fuel dependency. So this is what decarbonizing means if we find other sources of alternate sources of energy reliance, but at the same time, we can also therefore think about issues around degrowth. How do we reduce our systems of production, consumption, disposal, and waste? Because it is a hyper-consumptive lifestyle that fuels this fossil military industrial complex. So if we can do it at both ends, both at the fossil production and extraction end, but then also the consumer end, and we think about that spectrum across space and time, we're able to put what's happening in Ukraine on a wider historical and geographical map.
Excellent. So we have a few more. So I'm going to just read what Alex Stinson wrote here. So we know A, that most scholarship is being published in English. B, the IPCC Working Group 2 report emphasizes the need for billions of adaptation decisions, and that C, most decision makers are monolingual, or if they have secondary languages, it's frequently not English. Can you talk about how the language gap is affecting climate action and justice? Ooh, jumped. How have knowledge gaps at the lowest possible decision maker prevented justice-oriented adaptation? Great question.
If I understood the question, it was a long one, but it was about a language hegemony, right? Okay, so yeah, so Eurocentric biases in academic knowledge production, especially in Anglo-European epistemological framings, definitely there is that kind of, English is a colonizing language. All European-based languages that are very dominant are kind of lingua franca to say in the global meetings in global documents. They do get translated. If they're made in English, they're often translated to like Spanish and French and sometimes to Arabic. And I think what's happening is there's increasing effort made to have resources available for that translation, for transliteration, but then also in terms of real-time translation into other languages. So it's not just a written word that's get translated, but then how do you have like events that are multilingual? And it is at the same time, that is just the output, right? What about the input? That is what I was talking about. Like, who are the experts who are being invited? Whose voices are being captured in these global documents? That has been critiqued in terms of that kind of Eurocentric hegemony about, whose voices is often similar, same people, it's from the global north, often men, often white. So who are being marginalized or invisibilized? And this is why I keep raising the issue about whose knowledge counts, who is the expert, who is the expertise. So when we start to decolonize knowledge and practices, we start to therefore have different forms of voices, which actually then operate in their own linguistic base that we then need to translate into English. So those of us who can't speak all the 30 different languages we may need to have a form of understanding. So it goes both ways. So if we want to have what's being done in dominant institutions translated, we need to also therefore step aside and not just have everything be produced by people who have access to Anglo-European academy, to Anglo-European knowledge, and to spaces, but to create a much wider opportunity. So this is what I mean by not just having a seat at the table, but dismantling and then remantling what the table is. What are the terms of the debate? Who has decision-making power? Who has agenda-setting power? Who's at the table in the first place, and how is the table being defined? So those are the kinds of conversations that I hope help answer this question. I'm not entirely sure if I got the second half. That was the second half of a question, Danielle. I can't see all the questions.
Yeah, I think
for some reason.
You sort of got it. So it's like language, but then the second part was a bit broader, like how knowledge gaps generally prevent a justice-oriented adaptation.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I think I got to a little bit of that in terms of, so we don't even know what our knowledge gaps are until we go looking, right? And this is why I think it's really important that we do that kind of not just interdisciplinary education, but transdisciplinary in terms of reading beyond what we need in our disciplines or in our education, but to that re-education, that self-education, which it requires that unlearning and relearning. And it's this continual process. This is how we start to overcome these gaps in terms of what we know, but then also the knowledge that is knowable or at hand for policymakers. So what are the different ways that different knowledges can be elevated and then made available for decision makers or people in power? If we can't shift power structures, how do we get different forms of knowledges and voices to, powers that be, so that more equitable decisions and policies and planning and budgetary allocations are made? So there are different points at which we can have interventions, but it often comes with that self-reflexivity. If we don't work on ourselves, we can't work with others.
Excellent, thank you. So I'm going to work to summarize these questions instead of reading the whole thing this time. So from Zoe DeCiccio is asking, I think, how, given the issues, the same justice issues that come up in mining and stuff with clean energy, how do we move forward with clean energy while mitigating the harm to the planet and to communities?
Right, so that's an excellent question, because these are questions that are coming up right now, especially because the energy transition really needs to happen in countries like the USA and Canada, and across Europe, or other places of real hyper energy usage or high energy lifestyles. And those kinds of energy transitions, the mitigation work is already late, right? It should have been happening a while ago, because there's a lot of work being done on adaptation, but you can only adapt so much, right? After a while, it becomes loss and damage. You've lost your homeland, your ecology is destroyed, your livelihood is not tractable anymore. So therefore, mitigation is a big thing, especially for high greenhouse gas emitting countries like the US. And this is an issue about the rare earth minerals that are being used for, let's say, the EVs, right? The electric vehicles, the solar panels, and the conversations around sacrifice zones come up, like where are these minerals being mined, which communities are being impacted, how are we producing reduce energy usage, but at the same time creating these sacrifice zones and complete landscapes of desolation in other places. And I think those are the really hard conversations that we need to have, but those conversations aren't always being had. That's the problem. People kind of fetishize EVs and photovoltaic cells and so on. Great, we're having these conversations, but let's also look at total cost of ownership. What is do a CBA, cost benefit analysis, and try to internalize those externalities. How are you compensating communities that you're extracting from? Are there better ways to do this? Are you compensating them in livelihood forms, in agroecology, in preserving biodiversity? So there are all kinds of different forms of conversations that are still yet to be had more rigorously. And I think those are the kind of ways that a lot of, like, for instance, indigenous communities are pushing back to mineral mining, fossil fuel extractivism, and so on. And we need to have these conversations in the clean energy transition, because otherwise what will happen is we'll default back to that kind of techno-managerialistic utopia, without recognizing much later the harms that have been left in its wake. So I think these are the kinds of discussions we need to have much more rigorously.
Great. Next, we have a question from Archana asking, how do you see critical climate justice in relation to our economic system? And she points out that racial capitalism and growth drive a lot of the climate crisis, but socialist economies also have not been equitable. So what can critical climate justice sort of offer us in that area?
Right. So it's not like a socialist economy is the direct opposite of the capitalist economy, right? So even though that's kind of how it's been taught in the US, especially since Cold War geopolitics, post World War II. So yes, you're right. In terms of many socialist economies are not some utopia, and neither are racial capitalistic economies. So it's a question of, like, how can critical climate justice force us to have these conversations, or make us ask these questions to configure a pathway? Can you have more benign forms of capitalism or better forms of socialism? Can we think about, for instance, other ways of subverting these systems? I think we've fallen into this binary thinking post World War II, especially with the American and former Soviet politics in terms of Cold War geopolitics, and that it has to be US capitalism or Soviet communism or socialism, and then is there nothing in between? You know, for instance, if you look at some scholars who are talking about like post-development or degrowth, you know, can you operate within a capitalist economy but think about well-being away from economic growth? You don't have to have, you know, 5% economic growth every year. That's an infinite amount of growth on a finite planet. So can we think about well-being with less consumption, less throughput, less waste? So in a way, yes, it's still capitalism, but it looks very different from the rapacious racial capitalism that we currently live under. So there are different ways to have these conversations, I think. There's no perfect solution. I always tell this to my students, if I had the perfect solution, I wouldn't be in front of you, right? I'd be ruling the world. So no one person has all the solutions. All we can do is ask each of us to hold ourselves more accountable, ask harder questions, to push the conversations forward, or, you know, to kind of scratch at the margins of theoretical interventions, but then also pragmatic interventions, and then also think about world making. What does a different form of world making look like away from capitalism? So if you ask young people to draw out what an ideal solution would be, they're quite creative in terms of thinking about, living with kin, in terms of, for instance, if you take into account different indigenous cosmologies that are neither capitalist or socialist, very different sets of relationships, and yet those often don't get prioritized. And I think these are the kinds of conversations we need to have that help us move away from capitalism that isn't necessarily Soviet form of socialism.
Excellent. We've got a bunch more questions in the chat. We'll see how many we can get to. So from David Frank, we have a question. How would you respond to those who argue that justice issues are too difficult to address in the limited time we have to decarbonize our economies? Even anti-capitalists might argue that we don't have enough time to take all these issues into account. So how do you address that?
I think the question of time and that we can't do it is the one that's been holding us back for a long time, that we can't do this, we don't have enough money, it's too hard. We don't move anywhere if we don't intentionally say, yes, we do have time, yes, we can allocate money, yes, we will intentionally do this. So I think, yes, there is a question of time in terms of the nature of where we are with climate breakdown. Yes, we may not be able to transform capitalism, but we can chip away at it. So it's not, again, we need to get outside of this binary thinking that it's either or. I don't think either or framings help us, that, you know, if we do, it's all or nothing, because that leads to that kind of doomerism or the nihilistic thinking. If I don't have a perfect solution, I'm not going to do anything. And I think this is exactly what the fossil fuel industry and the global capitalists would like us to do. Feel that sense of despair and that sense of like, we can't do it, it's too late, we don't do anything at all. And I think we need to therefore have those conversations that, okay, what do anti-capitalist or anti-colonial scholars and activists teach us? What are the things that we can apply? What are the different philosophies that can help us think through certain things, to get away from that binary thinking, to think about what are the transformations we can do at smaller scales, and then how can we link that up with other transformations? How can we scale it up? Because things happen even when you're not thinking about it, right? People are chipping away and doing things, and then they become normal. The world we live in right now, there's nothing normal about it. It was entirely man-made, and I can say man-made. It was created by man. It was created very much by Euro-American hegemony, a very specific men. So therefore, it's entirely man-made. There's nothing normal about it. We didn't just drop out of the sky like this. This system was created, right? The Industrial Revolution just didn't happen in Europe because, I mean, European ingenuity. It happened because Europe colonized and decimated the rest of the planet, right? That, for, the slavery and land grabs in Africa and Asia and Latin America fueled the Industrial Revolution. So there's nothing inherently benign about Industrial Revolution. It came at a deep cost. So if we think about the way the system was created, we are people too. We are part of a system. We can create other systems too. We just need to demand it and do it.
Excellent. So we have another question from Suba, and I hope I'm summarizing this correctly. I think there's two parts. So one, your thoughts, you'd love to hear your thoughts on the promises and difficulties for broadening the lens of climate justice to include to address the intersection of these multiple issues, and the resultant challenges for action incorporating all these intersectional issues. And then the next, I think you just started to get to, is what are the scales at which you think action might be most effectively directed?
Okay, so I think action is easier to do when it's local and small chunks. So this is what I mean by do what you can with what you have from where you are and then do better. And I've said this statement for over a decade and so many times. I think some people just know that I will say it at some point in a talk, that if you do something small, like let's say you take legislative action, or you run for political office, or you work with an activist group, or something small, and then you do something bigger, or you can leapfrog into something bigger, like maybe you run for a wider level political body, or you intervene in different ways, or you come up with different ideas and mobilize different groups of people and raise funds. So there are a lot of different points at which you can get involved, but I always think people feel it's more doable in bite-sized chunks, except for some people who just really want to get involved in much bigger ways, right, at the international or country level. So I think there are different ways people can get involved. So I think that was the second half of the question. Is the first half of the question how to do these across scale, something like that?
Yeah, it was more about the promises and difficulties for broadening the lens of climate justice across these intersectional issues.
Right. Yeah, excellent question. So this is something that I talk a lot about in terms when I talk to different organizations. That is great. We're doing something that makes sense with the communities that you're invested in. So it's very much place-based. Then how do you link up to other place-based? Or rather, what if your place-based action is leading to injustices elsewhere, right? So it goes back to the prior question about, for instance, mining, right? And EVs and so on. And then how do we have therefore conversations around what needs to be done? So once you acknowledge that something is great for one place but might not be another, then we can have those conversations. Or might be that something that's great here is also great there, and then people can replicate and learn from each other or do better. So there are different ways that places can kind of come together, that can have conversations, but then we can also think about scalar. So if we go from like local to national or federal, you can think about many, many small scales collectivizing to work at a national scale, or different national scales working with other national scales. So for instance, one of them is very visible at the, for instance, at the IPCC or at the COPs in terms of the Vulnerable Countries Forum, in terms of small island nation states or other coastal countries across the global south, in terms of the forum they've created so that individually they may not have a lot of voice, but together they can try to have some sort of, representation. So there are different scales at which you can intervene. So even at the international scale, you can think of small localities coming together to intervene internationally. And then we can think about other forms of interventions. We talked about linguistic hegemony, different forms of, linguistic translation services, maybe litigation. Maybe you need to provide services for lawyers who need to be there to deal with unfair trade, regulations at the WTO, because trade and food and commodity production, that's as much about climate as well, because it impacts ecosystems and water bodies and communities. So there are different ways you can act locally and think globally, or act globally, but be from a local. So I think we just need to be really kind of creative and capacious and be open and willing to learn, and then observe and then relearn and then do better.
Thank you. Great. And we have one more question in the chat. If you have time for, if you have the energy for another one, Farhana. And then I think we'll probably wrap up if that's okay with everyone, unless we have something really pressing that someone wants to ask. So I'm so sorry for the person who put this in the chat. I cannot read the language that this was typed in, that your name is typed in. So unattributed, but if you want to say your name, you're welcome.
It looks like Steve Lemeshko.
Thank you, Ike. Amazing. Okay, so this person says, you've mentioned that democracy is an essential part of sustainable development, but what can be done from the point of the world community regarding sustainability practices in autocracies or even harsher regimes such as Russia or Iran?
Okay, say that again. The sound broke out. Something about regimes.
That's okay. Let me read it one more time. So you were talking about democracy as an essential part of sustainable development, but what about context where it's a more autocratic context, such as Russia or Iran?
Okay, yes. So basically, that is another concern, absolutely, in terms of thinking about what do we mean by democracy? What does it look like in the local context? And yes, democracy doesn't just apply to capitalist countries. There's autocratic countries, but we're also seeing authoritarian populism, let's say in Latin America, right? You're seeing, or in other parts, whether it's in Brazil or Turkey or elsewhere. So it's different forms of regimes come into power, and then they link up with other forms of regimes. I mean, so what we're seeing, that kind of autocratic turn, even in so-called democracies of India or Turkey or Brazil, those have real outcomes, right? They impact lived experiences of billions of people. And then you also have religious autocratic regimes. And the funny thing is, we talk about in the US being democracy, but if you look at the US laws, in many ways, it seems like a theocracy, right? And controlling of women's bodies and issues around free speech. There's a lot of kind of evangelical Christianity that holds US democracy hostage. So, when we think about a religious autocracy, I always bring this up. In what ways is America not a religious autocracy? In some ways, sure, there are a lot of great benefits and great actions and practices of democracy, but in many ways that democracy gets eroded, right? When there's these forms of kind of captures by theocracy. So yes, we look at what's happening in, let's say, the Middle East, specifically a huge ally of the US like Saudi Arabia. How do we think about democracy? What does it look like in those countries? What do the constituents want? And why are they being kind of denied the different forms they envision for themselves? We shouldn't impose what we think is democracy on some place. So even when I talk about democracy, I don't mean that there's one universal theory of democracy, because that again looks different in different places. People should have that right to self-determination and political organization as they deem fit within their community and their nation state, but at the same time recognizing that no state is isolated. Every nation state is under geopolitical influence and alliances of other nation states, and this makes it really hard, absolutely, when to have these conversations around democracy, whether it's Iran or Brazil or India or the US. And I think we need to have these more expansive, critical conversations without defaulting to an argument that the US is the only democracy and the only model that everyone should aspire towards. Because I think that uncritical assumption, it again leads to that kind of centralization of meaning, that kind of sedimentation and fossilization of our understanding, instead of keeping it open to kind of re-theorizing, to that critical reflection, to thinking about what does it mean to think from the ground up, so that we're able to have these conversations in a much more capacious way.
Excellent, and that's our chat. I give you, did you have anything you wanted to add before we wrap up, or?
No, that's okay. Thank you.
Yeah,
this was a wonderful talk.
Yeah, I saw Dr. Sultana just dropped her website in the chat too, so I'll give everyone a moment. It's pretty easy to remember, just her name, farhanasultana.com. And I definitely encourage you all to check out her work and check out the article, Critical Climate Justice, that this talk was based on. So thank you all for coming. Thank you again, Dr. Sultana, for joining us for this talk. We're so excited that we were able to have you here virtually. And one day, hopefully we'll all be able to meet in person. And
thank you so much, Danielle. Thank you, Danielle and Uri, for inviting me, and to the Watson Institute. And thank you, everyone who joined us today on a lovely Friday afternoon in the US Northeast. So I know many folks are outside, and I'm happy to, have conversations ongoing with folks. I know there's a lot of questions that I had to really breeze through, because there are a lot of questions coming in rapid fire. And, I invite you to check out my publications that are accessible on my website, or check out my other talks. Thank you again.